So you and your religious freedom. How about this? How about religious freedom is a contradiction in terms? I do not want to fight for a society where all religions are treated equally. I want to fight for a society where the ignorance of religion and superstition is abolished. I am consequently not a multiculturalist so much as I am a post-culturalist. I have no interest in concepts of cultural conservatism, and I do not accept the concept of cultural appropriation, which is a conservative concept. I'll talk about that in a minute. I seek hybridization and integration. I want to shuffle things up. My concept of the ideal future is one where we do not live in tribes defined by race and religion, but in a single global culture defined by concepts of science and progress. I will consequently never stand up for any religion, and I will rarely stand up for the right to practice a religion either. I cannot make sense of the idea of a right to be enslaved. I will only stand up against racism, and this is an empirical question. It is an empirical position backed by evidence because it is an empirical question and not a moral one, a moral question. Racism? This is a long-standing difference between communists and liberals. Communists cannot make sense of the idea of religious freedom, whereas, quote-unquote, whereas liberals are ultimately agents of the bourgeois class anyways and willing to go along with their tools of control for their own ends. That's why we have religion after all, right? This discussion is also one of the oldest on the left, with anarchists and communists having huge amounts of difficulty grappling with what has been a arresting catch-22, and sometimes breaking with each other on tactics. If you read the history of it, it's like people arguing over like how it's kind of a big problem, right? Because it's hard to get at sort of the peasantry and the working classes without accepting a certain concept of their religion. You show up there and you start going after their religion, and they're not going to listen to you, they're not going to accept you, but it's their religion that's keeping them enslaved. So you can't get rid of capitalism unless you get rid of religion first, and you can't get rid of religion unless you get rid of capitalism first. You have to get rid of religion and capitalism at the same time. It's the hard part. How do you organize people against what they think is their identity? You see the same thing with language rights, right? Religion and language are like, it's like the way that the ruling class stamps you as and says they own you, right? So what does it mean to be French? It means that the French king owns you. I know that we're a little bit beyond that, but we're still kind of lost in it, right? What does it mean to be Russian? It means to say that the Tsar owns you through, the feudal networks and systems and whatnot. And what does it mean to be Catholic? It means that the Pope owns you. These are tags, these are relations of property, language, religion, ethnicity. Especially in Europe, and I'm using Europe because I am mostly European, and most people that are going to watch this are mostly European, right? Half the countries in Europe didn't exist 100 years ago. Like even France, we think of France as pretty, we can take the Franks back to the fall of the Roman Empire. But French as a language, like, the south of France spoke a different language. The north of France, you've got the Bretons, you've got, this idea of France as a nation state is very recent. And what does it mean? It means that you're under the feudal control of the French emperor, right? Even as they're abolishing feudalism, they're still enforcing their ownership over you. The French Revolution abolished feudalism, but converted you into into property of the state nonetheless. And all these wars are like fighting over who gets to own which slaves. And they work these identities up that are just property relations. Italy is another example. Even Germany. Actually, Germany is one of the best examples. Like dozens of little countries run by feudal lords, and at the end of it, the Kaiser takes over and owns all of you. Language, ethnicity, religion are just marks of ownership by a ruling class. They don't define who you are. They're not identities to withhold. They're not things that make you special or that you should want to explore. If you want to emancipate yourself, you should abolish them. Reclaiming yourself as an individual means getting out of the control of ethnicity and out of the control of religion and out of the control of language. And this is a difficulty that anarchists, and to a lesser extent communists, have had over all of these years, is how do we get to these people and try to explain this to them when they think that the chains are the things that make them who they are. It's the problem, it's the parable of the cave, right? The allegory of the cave. You don't know what freedom is because all you've ever known is slavery. And it's really hard. This might be the problem that helps us get to communism in the end. If you can figure out how to get rid of religion and capitalism, or, in some order, if you can figure this out. Because if you go after religion, then capitalism will fight you. And if you go after capitalism, then religion will fight you. And you're stuck. The general left anarchist position is that Soviets and Maoists took an unproductive approach to eliminating superstition, and that this was a predictable consequence of trying to use status institutions to get to communism. Anarchists don't have an answer to this really, but we knew from day one that this whole, let's take control of the, dictatorship of the proletariat, or, status control of things, and, enforce our will on others. We knew that probably wasn't going to work. And what's happened? What's the consequence of this? Well, the modern Chinese state is not communist, it's Confucianist. And in Russia, the church is now more powerful than the Kremlin, and has been for a while. It didn't work. Not only did it not work, but it backfired in massive ways. Not only did these regimes fail to destroy superstition amongst their peasantry, but those religions are now dominant cultural norms in both of those societies. Russia is as backwards now as it ever was. Again, this is one of the things that anarchists, we pat ourselves on the back, we pride ourselves, we think we're smarter than communists because we knew better. I can't get my head around anybody that wants to still uphold this Marxist concept of religion. Forget about the moral aspect of it. It was a horrible failure. Can you not see how poorly this worked? It didn't work at all. It failed. It was a horrible failure. Out of all the failures of Marxism, the failure to abolish religion is the most powerful one. Because there's a pretty good argument that had, the Soviets actually managed to abolish religion, then they'd probably still be sitting there. It's a pretty good argument that the Catholic Church certainly was pretty instrumental in the collapse of communism in Russia. And if you look in, the Maoists tried the whole Cultural Revolution thing. That didn't work. The Confucianism is dominant in the society nowadays. Again, China is not a communist country. It's a Confucianist dictatorship. But I'm not making a moral criticism. If I thought it would work, I'd actually support it. If I thought we could round up all the religion people and just eject them to the moon or something, I'd be in favor of it. We can't do it. It won't work. It's a bad tactic. We have to be smarter than that. Because ultimately we have to convince people that we're better, right? By being better. I know this sounds flippant, right? But we have to convince them that we're better because we are better by being better, right? Showing up with guns and ordering people around, it's a shitty tactic, it doesn't work, there's no ends to it. But make no mistake, I do share the end goal of the permanent abolition of religion. My take on it is that we need tabula rasa. Or all is lost and Hobbes is right. But on the assumption that we do have a tabula rasa that is no innate human nature, then we should be able to transcend religion if we decide to. That sounds very simple, doesn't it? We just have to decide we don't want religion anymore, and it'll go away. It's fundamentally true, but how do we get there? Well, even that is simple enough. We have to convince each other. Well, I think that there's a pretty good argument that as wealth increases, then religion decreases. That's probably one of the more profound contradictions in capitalism, right? That you need systems of control for capitalism to work, but the more effective it is, the more those systems of control fade, right? Hey, I'm not too much into historical materialism, but let's remember that it's only capitalists that think of communism and capitalism in competition with each other, right? On the left, we think of capitalism and communism to be phases of the same system, not competing ideas. And so we argue that in order to get to communism, we have to go through capitalism first. And that once we've generated enough wealth, religion will probably kind of go away, kind of thing. I actually kind of accept that. I don't think the state's going to wither away anytime soon. I do think that if we get to a certain point of wealth generation, then religion will probably fade away. The biggest thing, that at its core, religion is a problem of wealth distribution. And it's a problem of poverty. And it's a problem of ignorance, right? I know a lot of people will look at various data and everything, but it's like, okay, yeah, maybe that guy's a doctor, but that guy's family's not doing so well, right? You can't take it out of context like that, right? In the meantime, I'm not going to get in the way. I do not consider restrictions on religious expression to be a meaningful rights violation because all religion is slavery. Government wants to come in and tell you that you can't worship here. I'm kind of not gonna. I have issues that are more important than me to deal with. Okay, but let's not get racist about it. And if there is racism involved, then my criticism and activism will focus very heavily around it. So, for example, I know that something that I think I maybe picked up a bit of a reputation for being for my argumentation regarding the cab, because it was a stupid argument, and I'm pretty good at making stupid people look stupid. Okay, but I need to clarify that I didn't oppose restrictions on the cab due to religious freedom. This was not an issue of religion to me. Like, this was not an argument about religion. This was an argument about totalitarian methods. Let's take a step back from the issue of religious accommodation, of religious freedom, and let's look at what was happening. The government was proposing a state-financed fashion police to go around and say, you can't wear that scarf. You know, excuse me, ma'am, that scarf is not allowed here. That's a faux pas. It's after Labor Day. It's absurd. I don't care about your religion. I don't want a fashion police. Alright? It's ridiculous. Actually, I've been clear that I actually kind of do think that Hillary Clinton is probably a cocaine addict, or at least a drunk. And that this is the source of her apparent health difficulties. That she's seizuring, she's overdosing. That's what you're seeing. You're seeing a woman overdose. Or at least that's what I think. I should maybe be a little bit less, a little bit less forceful in my, unfounded accusations. I don't think they're completely unfounded. I think that it's kind of obvious that that's what you're looking at, is you're looking at somebody overdose. And so, yeah, I would actually like to see the testing done. Now, I know that some people are twisting that around, right? Is Trump a cocaine addict? Well, if Trump's a cocaine addict, then he's handling it a lot better. I would like to see a drug test. I would be ecstatic to see that happen. I wouldn't count on it. Okay, so cultural appropriation. What do I think? Let's take a step back from your assumptions here. What I actually think is that the arguments against cultural appropriation are broadly very right-wing and do not belong on the left. These kids do not know the left from right, and I am now going to proceed to tear down the cultural appropriation argument from the left, exposing these kids not as Marxists, but as Burkean conservatives, who have been confused by the master manipulator, Foucault. There were battles being fought over relics and whatnot between indigenous groups and museums. Okay, in many cases, we were talking about direct theft in the colonial period, and a kind of theory developed out of this. Now, if you want to look at the actual issue that was being discussed, in most cases, yeah, I would argue in favor of returning the relics. Like I say, in a lot of cases, you've got some conquistador showed up, slaughtered the natives, stole their stuff, and sent it off to Spain. And now it's sitting there in a museum. Of course they should send it back. And the only reason the museum doesn't agree is because they're making money off of it. It's untenable. It's an absurd argument. What you need to do is you need to sit these people down, have a few beers, and just, smack some logic into them, get them out, make them feel really bad. No, like really, honestly. You're gonna sit there and you're gonna say you should hold on to these relics. You should make them fucking cry over this. Sit them down, have a beer with them, and break them down, make them start fucking sobbing, admit they're wrong, and not only are they going to send the relics back, but they're going to give them reparations at the end of it, because they realize that they're being assholes. That's not a legal argument, right? No, believe it or not, that's not a legal argument. Instead, we had a theory develop out of it. Okay, but because we live in a right-wing society, the theory that developed out of it was very right-wing. Surprise! It was a very propertarian, very tribal theory, and I cannot uphold any of it because it can't be synthesized with any left-wing concept of property. I know. You think that you're taking the side of the repressed indigenous group. But you're not actually. You're upholding a colonial system of property and you're applying it to a repressed indigenous group. And you're enforcing colonial concepts of property onto cultures that did not have concepts of property. It's actually very colonial. The cultural appropriation, it's not post-colonialism, it is colonialism. Because these ideas are not indigenous. They come out of colonial legal systems to try to deal with conflicts that have developed out of theft. So let's get out of the colonial legal system and let's take a look at what this idea is. Cultural appropriation relies on a kind of idea of tribal property that assigns intellectual property rights to members of a tribe based on their membership in that tribe, thereby excluding use of that intellectual property to individuals outside of the tribe. You can type that up, and there'll be a test in the morning. I don't think that this is the right argument to use if you want the relics back. I think the relics are the collective property of the tribe held in common. Not a right-wing propertarian argument, but an actual left-wing concept of property. How about that? And we can use this argument to get to the same end, but now I'm at a different point in the spectrum ideologically, and I'm going to come to different conclusions. Because this property isn't intellectual, it's physical. It's it's a warhead, or it's some pottery, or it's a sculpture or something. It's their stuff, right? and it should be thought of as their personal property if you can take the idea to a collective abstraction. The personal property of the tribe is the collective property of the tribe. Got that? We don't need to come up with these ideas of things being appropriated. We can just say, this is theirs. This physical thing belongs to them. Very simple. This physical thing belongs to them and it was stolen from them and it should be returned. We don't need any crazy theory. The simple nuts and bolts, of the reality in front of us is good enough, I think. But instead we got this theory that came out of it. And it runs into a lot of trouble when you actually start looking at it. Again, not from a right-wing liberal perspective, but from a left-wing, anarchist, socialist, communist perspective. Because what you're doing is you're abstracting the idea of a physical ownership of a physical good into tribal ownership of an idea or concept. And you can do this if you're on the right, because you believe in private property. But if you're on the left and you don't believe in private property, and you run into the contradiction that you are now upholding a concept of private property that is meant to operate at the exclusion of others. And you've been tricked. They brought you in telling you that you were helping the repressed, the repressed noble savages. You're in here to help them. And now what they've done is they've twisted this around on you, and they've got you upholding capitalist concepts of property rights. They got you. Now, does that mean that these kids are all a bunch of confused socialists and they don't really know? I don't think it does. I don't think that this is cognitive dissonance. In fact, I think that if you ask them about property, you'll realize that most of the people that are making this argument, their concept of property is actually fairly consistent with this. And the reason that it's not confusing them and it's not freaking them out, it never occurs to them is because they're capitalists. They have very liberal ideas of property. So they're not confused socialists that need to change their views on appropriation to align with their views on property. They're confused conservatives that don't realize how right-wing their ideas about property really are. So you get these arguments from the right, that are calling them socialists, and they call themselves socialists and everything else. So you might listen to what I'm saying and say, wait a second, if they're really socialists, shouldn't they oppose this? Okay, maybe if they were really socialists, but they're not really socialists. And if you take their views on this, and you compare it with their views on property rights in general, what you'll find out pretty quickly is that you're not arguing with a socialist. And if you're on the right, you got tricked too. Because they told you that those people over there were leftists. And they're not. They're conservatives. A true leftist would seek to abolish tribal control of private property and distribute it fairly amongst all people. Now, of course, that doesn't mean it's okay to be a racist. Taking away the cultural appropriation argument oftentimes does little more than lay the racism out starkly, right? If you take away the complicated words, the big words, they're buzzwords. If you take these away and you kind of drop the fuzzy thinking, the end point that you get in most of these arguments is not that this is okay. It's just that it becomes that much clearer that it's not okay. And so what you're going to see, if you look at sort of the issue after issue, the cultural appropriation card is more often than not used by racists right? To obscure how obvious their misconduct is. And they get into this blurry, confused argument about property rights that nobody really is able to think properly through because they don't really have the background to do it. And what you're doing is you're distracting. You're what's the word they use? You're derailing the real issue, right? The irony of it. I have a lot to say about these general kinds of things. What defines everything on all sides is like it's a lot of Orwellian trash being thrown around back and forth. They're both brainwashed, and they're both totally confused about what they're saying. But what is my position as a leftist, as somebody that does not accept concepts of property rights? Is that the idea that a tribe owns something or owns a concept of something that is not consistent with any idea of property that I can uphold. And I'm not going to uphold anybody's right to be a racist, but I'm not going to give anybody exclusive ownership of ideas. And I'm just going to leave you with kind of an idea here. If we did abstract this idea here, and we did allow tribes to have intellectual property over things that they've invented, whether it's their food or it's their culture, what would that leave white people with? And do you really want to uphold that? I know. Stop. I know you haven't thought this through. You weren't supposed to think it through.